necessarily the same as the width of a Lawrence screen, but if the Hummingbird screen is narrower than the Lawrence and they've got the same number of pixels on the horizontal, this will be a better quality of screen because those pixels are crammed into a smaller area. So always just keep that one in mind. So the quality of the screen is to do with the number of pixels vertically and horizontally with relation to the size of the screen. And when when you're doing your research, I was going to say get your brochures out, etc., but you're probably doing it online nowadays. You can just make little notes. That was 340 and the screen's 2 inches wide. That's 340 and the screen's 1 inch wide, or whatever. And that starts to give you an idea then of the quality of the screen. Now, the transducer power rating. There's 2 figures for transducer power ratings. I'll have a swig of tea and then we'll talk about that. Okay. I'm going to draw you a little diagram now. The sound wave, we have that as the sound wave. Okay, you're all good with that. There's 2 measurements of the transducer power that's making that sound wave. One measurement is just here, and this is known as peak to peak. So you can see that, and that's a pretty simple one. Obviously, the more powerful a transducer, the bigger the sound wave will be, so the peak to peak measurement gets bigger. The other measurement that's important, obviously we've got a vertical one there, it'll be something to do with horizontal. It is known as the RMS, the root mean square. Now, anyone who's particularly into their maths or they wish to remember back to their school days, and this is about the only thing in maths that I ever go back to. The root mean square is a posh term for the area under the curve. We're not going to bother going into all the mathematical reasons. Again, I'll just show you. So here, this area under the curve is important to the power rating of the transducer. So we end up with a root mean square figure. So power of transducers, again, 2 measurements, root mean square, peak to peak. And compare those between models within a range or between 2 or 3 different ranges. Compare an eagle to a hummingbird or whatever. Compare the root mean square and the peak to peak measurements on your transducers, and that tells you how powerful the transducer is going to be. So that really is the 2 key things to look at when buying a fish finder. If we look at the GPS side of things, GPS is pretty much GPS. There'll be slight amounts of variation in the accuracy, but really nowadays GPS, most of them's accurate to a couple of meters, which when you're out fishing, that's more accurate than you're going to be. So GPS, yeah, it's GPS, don't stress too much about that. The more important side of things as to where your money's going is your fish finder, and again, screen quality and transducer power. So that's what to look for in a unit. And now I guess we should probably move on to how it works. We kind of have a fundamental understanding now that there's this sound wave that bounces down and comes back, but there's a touch more to it. And in fact, if we would start from scratch to build a fish finder, there's a lot more to it. So the sound wave, if you can imagine, the sound wave gets transmitted into the water and it spreads out like a torch beam, like this. Boom, so down, and it hits the seabed, and then the sound wave bounces back up. Obviously not all of it gets picked up by the transducer, because some of it bounces off over here, some of it goes out there to my dining room, and some of it goes up the extractor chute there. But basically, if you imagine that as there's our transducer sitting on the surface, and the sound wave goes down there, boom. So several things to look at here. The most important being the beam angle, which is that there. Now, a single beam transducer will normally transmit a beam angle of about 19-20 degrees, so probably not far off that. So obviously that spreads down and we're scanning that much seabed, okay, or lake bed, whatever. That just takes me off on a slight tangent. Density of salt water and the density of fresh water are different, and on all good fish finders, which is pretty much all the ones you'll ever see, there'll be a setting to tell it whether you're in fresh water or salt water, because it does make a slight difference, especially to your depth readings. Particularly important if you're doing controlled depth fishing, which probably most of you aren't on kayaks, but just be aware that there is there'll be a thing in the settings just to change it between the two. So anyway, going back to beam angle, so we're picking up that much seabed, okay? If we were in shallower water, say up here, we'd only be picking up this much seabed. So the deeper the water, the more area of seabed we're going to cover with this. Because one thing you've got to understand, we're not fish finders. You don't really use them for finding fish. What they're much better at is finding good fishing spots, good locations. So we're looking for hollows, we're looking for wrecks, that kind of thing. That's really what we use a fish finder for, to find some good marks. So obviously you can see now that the depth you're operating in will affect what area of seabed you're scanning. If we're fishing sort of very close in, like if we're fishing for bass and we're only in a few metres of water, say that's a couple of metres deep, I'm scanning a very, very small area. So what I really want is a wider angle. So if I was in a couple of metres, I'd be scanning a much bigger area. So for shallow water, we want a wider angle. But if we went into deep water with a wider angle, say we went into 100 metres, we'd be covering such a massive area of seabed in deep water that we just don't know where anything is. We just know it's down there. Because you end up with such a big area being covered and shown to you on a screen like that, you don't know whether that little hollow is right under you or it could be 30 metres over there in deep water. So for deeper water, we really would want to go back to that. So for example, wreck fishing in, 20, 30, 40 metres of water, we want a narrow beam. But for bass fishing, close in, we want a wide beam. So there's a bit of a problem. In fact, it's not a problem because the clever guys years and years and years ago worked out that they could actually put two transducers in one little unit. So again, going back to looking at what you're going to buy, you can get dual beam units which do both a narrow and a wide beam. Now that's quite good, and within the menu system you can switch between the wide beam and the narrow beam, or certainly on the Humminbird units, and I think on a lot of the units nowadays you can switch it to auto and it will work out which is the better beam angle for you, because it knows the depth, because it's worked the depth out for you, so it knows. So you can leave those. I leave all of my units always on auto and they just sort themselves out. I don't even know which beam they're using most of the time, but I know they're using the best one for the depth. So that's kind of quite clever. We've moved on to dual beam units. And the dual beam, some of the Piranha Max units like that, sort of £100 mark, touch more, and you're into dual beam already. So it's almost not worth buying a single beam unit nowadays, because dual beam has come right down in price in the last few years, and just get a dual beam unit. Don't worry about it. It might cost you an extra tenner, at the most. But just kind of thinking on, if your unit does both beam angles, if you fired them at the same time, and you can't see that one now because it's inside, but if you fired them both at the same time, and a fish appears in both returns, the fish must be in the narrower area. Because if it only appears in the wider beam and not the narrower beam, the fish must be out to the side of the boat. If the fish appears in both, it must be in the middle. So you'll see on a lot of the units nowadays, the fish icons that get shown up on the screen where there's been an echo from a fish in the water column, a bounce back from the sound waves. Sometimes it's outlined, which means it's pretty much under the boat, it's in the narrow beam, and sometimes it's coloured in, which means it's out to the side. It's only appeared in the wide beam. So you know that the fish isn't under the boat, it's out to the side. So we're now starting to get, with dual beam units, when they're running both beams at the same time, you're starting to be able to tell more about where the fish is, whether it's more here or whether it's more out to the side. Obviously it doesn't tell a dual beam unit, it doesn't tell you which side the fish is sitting, whether it's out of the port or the starboard side. So we could go to tri-beam. Let's go 3 beams and have 2 like that and 1 in the middle. And that would then tell us, and some manufacturers make tri-beam units, and that's the advantage of a tri-beam unit, is that you can tell whether stuff's to the left, to the right, or in between. In between? No, underneath. Taking it on another 10 or 20 paces, if we had loads of transducers, all boom, 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 angled like that, we could tell a lot more about where stuff is. That essentially has taken us now into the world of side scan sonar, which is, I'll be straight, it's a hefty old price hike, but the information that you get for your money, the information you get bounce back from the seabed, lake bed, whatever, is absolutely phenomenal. It's pretty much as good as getting down there with massive visibility and having a good old look around with your snorkeling mask on and your tanks on your back. But you don't have to get wet, you can sit on your kayak. We'll do, I'm going to have a break now because I need to make another cup of tea, and we'll come back and do just a brief overview of side scan, because it's now available from quite a few manufacturers. Humminbird were the first people to bring it into the leisure market, but now I know there's at least 2 or 3 other manufacturers who are making side scan units of varying degrees of quality. And again, that leads us nicely into the roundup of check the power ratings of the transducer, both peak to peak and root mean squared RMS. Also always check the quality of the screen, because you can have all the information in the world, but if you don't have a good screen, you ain't going to see the information. So that's, if you remember nothing else from listening to me prattle on doing this, screen quality and power rating of the transducer, and your GPS will be fine, don't stress about that. So I'm off to make a cup of tea, and we'll come back and do side scan sonar. So back with it.